All right. Hello, everyone. I am so excited to be joining today. Like she said, I am based in Seattle, and I want to say thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak. I am really excited to get to share the work that's being done to improve HTML controls with you today. And we have a lot to get through, so I'm just going to go ahead and dive right in. So my name is Stephanie. I'm a program manager for Microsoft Edge Developer Experiences. And I'm fond of calling that my fancy title because underneath that, I'm a couple different things. I'm a designer, I have front end dev skills, and I'm also a developer and designer advocate for Microsoft Edge. And I have a personal story that relates to that ties into the pain points that I'm going to talk about today with styling HTML controls. So I come from a background in design, and I went to university for design. And when I graduated, I was a designer with minimal understanding of code. I could build websites in HTML and really basic CSS, but that more complex code and styling was way out of my skill set, and I didn't even understand or was aware of the web platform at all. And I'm also a child of the Flash era, where you could build these beautiful and deeply rich interactive experiences for the web, um, and make everything look like you wanted it to, like your form controls looked great. It was just like a paint and code your interactivity sort of experience. And so I spent more time learning how to use Flash and ActionScript than HTML and CSS. And like those limitations, again, with styling really didn't exist in Flash. Well, when I graduated, about a year after that, Flash died and became obsolete. It wasn't being used for websites anymore. And I got a job where I was responsible for the entire life cycle of a web project. So from research to design and development. And I would build these beautiful pixel perfect mockups in Illustrator with my beautifully designed form controls, and then I would show that to a client, and then I was responsible for building that site in HTML and CSS. And I spent countless nights hacking my HTML and my CSS to get what was rendering in the browser to look exactly like what I had shown my clients. And quite often, again, like I was kind of a code newbie, it felt like this. I would show clients the production site, and they would ask, why does this look different than your mock-up, and why does it look differently in Internet Explorer and Chrome? And they didn't actually find the answer, well, things just look differently in different browsers, as an acceptable answer, even though it was a perfectly good answer. And so I understand the pain points deeply around unsuccessfully styling controls and trying to get them to render the same across different platforms and browsers. And so today I'm hoping to help demystify some of these pain points around HTML controls, as well as talk about what's to come with HTML controls. And so we're going to dive into the past and find out why HTML controls are hard to work with, where we're at now, and the future, and what work is being done to improve these essential pieces of UI. And so to understand the current problems with controls, we need to review some history, and we need to go all the way back to the early days of the web. We need to go back to 1995. 1995 as a whole, like in terms of pop culture and just the world, was pretty great. So 1995 brought us Xena, Warrior Princess, which is personally like my favorite. The Macarena, Starbucks Frappuccinos were
So,
introduced.
sorry, Steph, is there meant to be a slide you're sharing? Because we can't see anything.
Oh, yep, did it stop sharing? Yep.
I think so. Sorry to interrupt.
Nope. Let's try that again.
I can see your desktop now.
Can you see us?
I can
Oh
see
yeah,
slides.
slides.
Okay, you can see the slides now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So 1995 brought us lots of amazing things, including Windows 95. And the most important thing, part of the story, was introduced in 1995 was the HTML 2.0 specification. So this specification is interesting because this was the first standard for HTML that was ratified by the W3C. So there was no official HTML 1.0 specification. There was a draft that had been circulating around in the early 90s, but what it covered was extremely basic in terms of features. And I'm actually reading a book right now by Tim Berners-Lee about the early days of the web, and it turns out like no one at CERN was interested at all in HTML. So that draft expired in early 1994. And then that was replaced with the HTML 2.0 draft. And that incorporated what was in HTML 1.0, but its main job was to document and standardize what was already out there in web browsers without breaking functionality. And this was the early days of the web, so you might be thinking that that doesn't sound too bad to sort of document everything that's out there. There can't have been that many web browsers in 1994. But there were actually quite a few, and there was a library of code that had been made available to developers, and that basically provided the building blocks for a web browser. And so between 1991 and 1994, all of these different browsers started to pop up. And what actually happened was because HTML was so feature sparse, all of these different browsers started implementing their own features to fill out feature gaps. So this huge rift in HTML started to grow up until the HTML 2.0 spec. And so this specification standardized what was out there in the web. And with that, we get the standardization of form functionality. So we get our first form controls. With that form functionality, it standardized a method for users to enter data into an HTML document, and for that data to be used to perform an action, such as logging into a website. And this is key to this story. So it standardized the method only for entering data. It didn't actually standardize the form parts or how they were constructed. And so now we have some standardized HTML. Things will render or be cross-browser compatible, but we're still missing something. This is still the early days of the web. We're lacking a styling language still. And so CSS wasn't actually supported by the HTML standard until 1997. And it wasn't actually even until 1999 with HTML 4.01 that browsers actually embraced CSS as the standard for styling. And so if we go back to 1995, we have our form controls, but we have no styling language to style them. So browsers had to rely on the operating system to render and style those form controls, and that led to a technical dependency on the operating system. And so later, even with early versions of CSS, there were parts of form controls that CSS just couldn't access. But there's another part to this too. Browser vendors were extremely reluctant to make controls stylable because they were a reflection of the operating system's visual appearance. So the idea that developers would want or need to make form controls look different from the operating system UI wasn't really a concept or a need. And so when we sort of finally accepted that developers wanted this, we were given the appearance property. But this only controlled the system level styling, and developers actually didn't use it the way it was intended, and it wasn't even implemented as designed in the spec. And so that led to many interoperability issues between browsers and lots of different vendor prefixes and other issues. And of course, Internet Explorer, as you can see, which had the most market share for a while, didn't even support appearance. And so up until recently, this feature was even marked as experimental under MDN docs. As of, I think, September, it is no longer marked as experimental. So it's a feature with a lot of history. And so to quickly recap the early days of the web. So pre 1995, we get lots of browsers that pop up. In 94, HTML 1.0, that draft expires. In 1995, we get HTML 2.0. Our basic form controls are standardized, but we have no standard for styling, which leads them to take an operating system dependency. And then by 1999, we finally have CSS, and it's embraced by browsers. And so, between 1999 and today, lots of things happen. I won't go into all of it because there's, of course, a lot that has happened. We've gotten new form controls, CSS has evolved, standards evolved, functionality has been enhanced. And so that leads us to today. It's been 25 years and the web has evolved, and you would think that we would have figured out how to solve this problem of styling form controls, but the truth is I wouldn't be here talking to you if we actually had solved that. And so MDN Docs has some great documentation around form controls and their stylability, and I've sort of bucketed them out into three categories to assess the landscape currently of working with controls. And so this first bucket, these form controls can be styled fairly easy. You're most likely not going to run into any issues when you try to style them with CSS. The second bucket is a little bit more complex. You're most likely going to have to be a little bit hacky and sneaky with your CSS, but it is possible to style them. And then this final bucket I like to lovingly refer to as the good night and good luck bucket, because these are incredibly difficult to style or impossible to style with CSS at all. I, again, spent many countless nights trying to style these in the early days of my career and wanted to rage through my desk sometimes. They're just so incredibly hard because of the way the web platform renders them and their underlying architecture. And so of those original form controls from the HTML 2.0 spec, we actually really didn't improve the ease of styling anything. In fact, we added more controls that are just more difficult to work with. And one thing I want to note here is that the CSS specification actually called out that user agents were the ones responsible for styling controls, and that browsers didn't even have to apply CSS to form controls, which then leads us to the next issue we have with them is browser inconsistencies. So they don't render the same across different browsers. And so on the one hand, again, I'm a designer, so these are different companies with different design languages. It makes sense that these would be different, but we're building for the web and we're building the same UI components. So we should be building to support things across multiple browsers. And their parts should at least be the same. And like I mentioned previously, it was only the method for entering data that was standardized, not the actual form parts. And on top of poor CSS access to style them and browser inconsistencies, we actually can't extend the functionality of a form control at all. This tweet from Scott Gell, I think, sums things up beautifully. You have one problem. You want icons in your select menu options. You decide to make a custom select menu. You now have at least 75 problems. And it's so true because when you rebuild a control completely from scratch instead of using the native control, you don't get all the good stuff that's already baked in from the browser. So you have to add things like accessibility back in. You have to ensure they're secure, and you have to ensure they're also performant. And so it's a bad developer experience to spend all this extra time recreating something that the platform provides, but when you can't control or when you can't extend your controls the way you need to, it's really necessary. And so a great example of this is the video element, where a developer either gets all of the controls or none of them by applying the controls attribute. There's no in between. And when we want our HTML controls to look like this, and even this, it's honestly no wonder developers have just reverted to building forms from scratch. And so On the browser side, we decided to take a step back and ask some questions to make sure that this was an area we should go invest in. We knew it was a pain point for developers, but were better native form controls something that developers really wanted? And actually, yes, they do. Very, very much. Very badly. So my former colleague Greg Whitworth, who is now at Salesforce, conducted a survey on form controls to start to dive deep into this space. The initial survey he sent out was on Twitter, and he had nearly 1,400 respondents, and they were in varying roles from full stack devs to designers with varying degrees of experience. And Greg asked respondents if they had ever used a library or framework or built controls from scratch, and if they did, which controls did they recreate? And these were the top 10, with the top 3 being select, checkbox, and date. And then Greg asked, why were people recreating form controls? And over a third said it was because they couldn't change the appearance. Another third wanted to add functionality. And just under a third said because of browser inconsistencies, which one might assume has to do with appearance. So if we bucket that in with the other response of couldn't change appearance sufficiently, that's over half of developers recreating form controls just because they can't change the visual appearance or they want to control it. That's a lot of dev time being spent just for appearance. And so Greg followed up with an amended survey where he asked JSConf.eu attendees the same questions and then 2 additional questions. He asked which form control gives you the most frustration and why. And select clearly stole the show here, with nearly half of respondents saying select. And then he asked why, and these were some of the responses he got. Select requires hacky shrinks. I can't style option elements at all to the extent we need to. But the amount of work it takes to implement an accessible alternative with complete feature parity is massive. And I can just feel the pain in this response here. And this prompted me to ask my own question. I wanted to know, how painful was it for developers? So back in January, I asked developer and design Twitter to please fill in the blank for me. I would rather blank than attempt to style a native select element. And you all really, really, really hate select, like with a very deep, deep passion. So I'm just going to read off a couple of my favorite responses. So I would rather call each person attempting to use the form and ask them what option they would like. I would rather build the entire site in Flash, support IE6, grind my teeth to the jawbone with rough sandpaper. I think this is my favorite. Heat up a rusty old fork with a few tines snapped off and broken, and then with both arms thrust it into my inner thigh, then attempt to style a native select menu. So clearly, this is a massive pain point for developers that we need to go fix. So let's talk about the future. Not just with select, but HTML controls all up, because there's actually a lot of good stuff in the works. So that I'm very, very excited about. So first off, let's talk about HTML. So HTML isn't done. It's a living language. The Edge team has been collaborating closely with Chrome, and we're doing a couple different things. So we're updating controls in the Chromium project, and these, what I'm about to show, should have landed already. But we wanted to focus on new styles and adding accessibility improvements. And so we wanted to bring some of the good stuff that Edge HTML, the Edge HTML engine, had over into Chromium, and then provide a much needed visual refresh. So we wanted to lose some of those gradients and those shadows and bring a much more neutral and universal style to form controls that we're hoping developers can leverage while we get the standards work started to allow for more in-depth customization. So hopefully this lessens the time spent recreating form controls just for appearance with this more neutral look. And then we're also looking at new native components. And so the community, again, has been key in signaling what new native components they would like. And so I'm excited to say that Chrome is working on two new native components. So they're working on virtual list and toggle switch. Virtual list, I'm not going to go into all the details about this, but if you are interested in some prototypes and more information, you can go to aka.ms/virtual scroller. And the same for toggle switch. So more info is at aka.ms/toggle-switch, and there's actually a prototype that you can go play with, and the Chrome team would love feedback on that to ensure that functions the way you expect a toggle switch to function. And so right now these are just proposals in the WICG, the Web Incubator Community Group. So after incubation, we need multi-implementer interest before this graduates to an HTML standard. And so if these are things that you want, it's absolutely key that you as developers go tell other implementers what it is you want. And so go reach out to Mozilla on their platform status or Twitter page, and the same for WebKit. And voice your opinion. It's super important. And now this is the stuff that I'm really excited about. So let's talk about fixing the current problems with controls. So I am so excited to say that an explainer with proposed solutions for how we're going to approach enabling customization of controls UI was released by the Chrome, Edge, and OpenUI teams back in August. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit. So the proposal for form controls is using the MVC design pattern, where a form control is made up of three distinct parts. So a model, a view, and controller. I'm not going to dive into all the details about this. There's a lot of information on the internet on this pattern. So feel free to go do your own research on that. But these are the goals that the proposed solution explainer has set out to accomplish. So we want developers to be able to style any arbitrary part of a native control. We want you to be able to add arbitrary content into a control, style a particular part without having to rewrite the whole UI, customize the UI without re-implementing the data model and code for reacting to user input. And we want to ensure that customized controls are accessible by default. So we don't want you to have to worry about some missing gap in accessibility. It will be there no matter how you customize your control. And so we're proposing three different solutions that offer quite a range of flexibility and customization depending on what the developer wants to do. And so our first solution is standardized control UI anatomy, parts, and behavior. And so we talked about the history of controls, and the root of the issue is that form controls and their parts aren't standardized and they're not reachable by developers. And so OpenUI is an initiative under the WICG that is driving this work, and they're working to standardize form controls and components and really getting down into the nitty-gritty, some very in-depth conversations about how a control works. And so the goals of OpenUI, the OpenUI team, which I would also like to say is open to anyone who would like to participate. It's focused on researching and documenting design systems and frameworks that are already out there today. They're identifying patterns in naming and use cases with controls. And then they're using those patterns to establish CalPaths for standards and eventually browsers. And so because select is the biggest pain point for developers, it was the first form control that OpenUI started to research. And there's actually an editor's draft proposal for select on the OpenUI website if you want to go check that out and give feedback and get involved in that. And within that draft is the proposed anatomy for a control. And so when I talk about standardizing control anatomy, I'll use select as an example of what that looks like. And so here we have our diagram. And so the anatomy of a select would be defined as consisting of one button part containing one selected value part and one pop-up list box part containing 0 to n option parts. And then we would then go on to define the expected behavior of a select, what happens when you click on it, and so on. And so the standardized anatomy, it will allow the styling of native parts using pseudo classes and the part pseudo element. So a developer will be able to change the color of a select button in an interoperable manner without replacing any of the HTML. So in our example here, we have our CSS class called styled select, and we're utilizing the part pseudo element to target the button to change the background color. And if you notice here, the HTML code is just the code of a normal select today, so you wouldn't actually have to rewrite any of the actual form control. We're just exposing the parts of the select and giving devs access to styling via pseudo elements and classes. And just as a note, additional states will also be standardized. So again, using select as an example, we have the open state here, so you could target what color the button is while the select is actually open. And our second proposal enables more powerful customization of controls and content with something called named slots. So a set of slot names will correspond to each piece of the controls view that a developer might want to replace with their own content. So in the case of select, we would have a slot equals button and a slot equals list box. And that will indicate to the platform that custom content will be slotted in by the developer. In addition, developers would add part equals button and part equals list box, which I will explain a little bit more about in a moment. And so if you've ever wanted to add like a country flag or something to, or some other sort of visual content to a dropdown, this will allow you to do that without having to rewrite the whole control from scratch. And slots will also provide the flexibility to customize only parts of the control. So we'll use the input type equals range here as an example. So a developer could provide a slot and a part for the little movable thumb and not the track part. The track would then automatically fall back to the default provided by the web platform. And I just want to note here too, with this this solution, there's actually quite a bit of work that needs to be done to input to make this work. So I would check out the explainer for a lot more detail on that. And so I mentioned parts, having to add a part equals button and slot equals button, and you might be wondering why you have to do that. So platform code will be wired up to identify elements corresponding to the required control parts, and it will apply native event handlers where applicable to handle user input. So this will let developers make UI tweaks without having to write a lot of JavaScript to handle the input, and it also ensures that those customized user interfaces can handle all of the input modalities that users expect. So we're trying to let the platform do what it was meant to do and apply those things for you. And our final proposal is our third solution for customized controls is shadow DOM replacement. So currently, if you try to attach shadow, you can't call that on a form control currently. It throws an exception. We're proposing this restriction be removed when enabling customization for a given control type, and calling attach shadow will result in the default user agent shadow DOM being swapped out with a new shadow root that would then be populated with content provided by the developer. And developers will still be required to label the core parts of their shadow DOM using that part attribute, otherwise the shadow DOM will not be rendered. And we're requiring that so that we ensure that the correct accessibility, semantics, and user input event handlers get applied by the platform. The platform is not going to make an attempt to guess at the correct behavior and won't render an incomplete control implementation. And again, this just allows the platform to do what it is supposed to do and why it is there, and handle all that stuff that we don't want you to spend time rewriting. And so I want to give a quick shout out to the folks on the Microsoft and Google and Salesforce teams who worked on putting this explainer together. There's a lot more detail at aka.ms/controls-explainer. Please go give it a read and provide feedback if this is a space that interests you. Because at the end of the day, We need your input. We need your feedback and your opinions on this work. And there are a couple different ways to do that. So you can provide feedback on the current HTML control prototypes that Chrome has that I mentioned for toggle switch and virtual scroller. You can contribute to the form control investigations on OpenUI. Again, that group is completely open. Tell browser vendors what you need from your form controls. Please tweet us or go read the explainer and start a discussion like we are listening. And if you're on Twitter, go follow these folks. So Melanie said is the Microsoft Edge PM leading this work. Greg Whitworth is at Salesforce leading OpenUI. Stubbornella is Nicole Sullivan. She's the Google Chrome PM on this. And I'm Ciata. I support Melanie. And I will make sure your feedback gets into the right people. Because we are here to listen. Because all of these improvements are for you. And we want to ensure that we're building the right thing for you. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. That was a really, really great talk. I've definitely spent a lot of hours trying to style a form, so this hit home. So we have a couple of questions. Anybody else, don't forget you can throw your questions in the Q&A or in the chat. First one we have is, what is the biggest challenge with making the controls more stylable?
So I've sat in on quite a few meetings and actually like getting down into like what the definition, trying to get people to agree on what the definition or how a control should be constructed is like that is requires so much discussion and just getting people to agree on okay, this is what a select is and what does a select do. That's been the I think the biggest issue. Like all the technical stuff is fine. We figured that out. It's just trying to get different implementers to agree on all those different parts and the definition of what each control actually is and what its purpose is.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I actually missed the first question, which was, what is your favorite Disney film?
101 Dalmatians, like the original like animated one.
Is there and why? Why is that one?
I like even when I was little, like I liked the illustration style. Like it was very moody. I don't know. I was always drawn to it, and I was actually thinking about it the other day because that was like it's again still my favorite Disney movie. But and like I think because so if you follow me on social media, you know that I love the UK, and I'm like starting to piece together that like that's where my love of London came from. Like way back in the day, it was this illustrated version of what London looked like. So
Nice. Cool. So another question we have is, as more people are browsed on mobile, how do you see web styling changing over the next 5-10 years?
oof. That's a good question. I think so. Are you talking about controls specifically?
Yeah, for controls.
So mobile is actually a whole different sort of interesting challenge with form controls. Because of the way that the platform, like on iOS, provides it natively, it's very different. I don't have a concrete answer to that, but it is something that we're considering. But like the stuff that's being done here, that all of that should be accessible on mobile, and nothing would change there. So if that makes sense.
Yeah, great. And then do you have any like favorite resources for learning more about this stuff other than what you've shared? Do you have anybody that's interested in getting into design or web development?
So for HTML controls specifically, if you go search like CSS tricks or Smashing Magazine, there's a ton of articles about customizing controls and working with them. And just those two websites in general are like my go-to for any sort of web dev and web design stuff. And if you're interested in like more of the work being done right now for HTML controls, Greg Whitworth, who I mentioned a couple times, if you go read his blog, he has some interesting articles and much more research that he shared out around HTML controls and the problems that developers face that you can go dive into there.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. Unless we have any other questions, I think that's it. Cool. Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.